say something that they think is wrong. Without people like that, grassroots folks on the ground, I wouldn't be able to get the information that I get. And so yeah, this story is extraordinary. I've written about a lot of different science and environmental topics. This one is completely different and just has blown me away multiple times. It's essentially just dropping down a rabbit hole and just going deeper and deeper. And also, the topic, I'll lay it out in one sentence. It's looking into the radioactivity brought to the surface in oil and gas development and the many different harms posed to the industry's workers, the public and communities, and the environment. And my method of research was to find the information I could on the topic, read those documents, read those reports. If there's a scientist who wrote it and they're still around, contact them, have a dialogue with them, follow up to see who they recommended, read another set of reports, and see the interesting citations in that one, and just keep going and going. And it led on for 20 months, which is a very long time for a magazine story. So this is just a picture from the cover. The magazine is, the story is out online now, and the magazine will be out in just a couple weeks at the beginning of February. And yeah, if you haven't read it yet, there's a lot of information there. Hopefully you can check it out after. So I'll just go to, so this is a quote from one of the sources, many sources, not just workers, not just community members, a lot of scientists, policymakers, across, there's so many types of science involved here, but this is a really fantastic expert, Dr. Marco Peltzman, and he just lays it out so clearly. Essentially what you are doing is taking an underground radioactive reservoir and bringing it up to the biosphere where it can interact with people and the environment. We think of oil and gas development as oil and gas, and of course we use these products and they create jobs, yes, but there's a whole other thing happening there. You are also bringing up radioactivity, and that's just something that isn't publicized, that isn't known in our minds, and it's something I had no idea about until I started doing this reporting. And so this is a diagram I've drawn, and the reason it exists, there's not that much information on this topic. There is no textbook on oil and gas radioactivity. There are some great research documents, but it's difficult to get all the information, and this actually can help explain a lot of it. So, we have this idea of conventional oil and gas wells, and I know there are conventional wells across a lot of northeastern Ohio. And then we have fracking, which is this new type of drilling, at least in its present form, new, often referred to as unconventional. So all of it, the mother lode for oil and gas, is coming from what's called a black shale. And if you imagine a shallow marine environment, something like the Gulf of Mexico right now, you have a lot of dead organic material falling to the bottom, and this is, rich material. It's organic material that, in the future, when that layer is compacted, that is your future oil and gas bearing layer. In the same setting, in this shallow marine environment, you're also accumulating uranium-238 and thorium-232. These are long-lived radioactive elements, and they're just baked in from the beginning in black shales. So right away, we quickly can solve, the question like, well, is it really radioactive? Well, absolutely it is. And not only that, our own scientists at the USGS have looked at this in detail. So this paper, again, it's like a series of steps, a series of falls down the rabbit hole with ledges where I could grab on and understand something, and this was an important one. The USGS had this paper, 1960, oil yield and uranium content of black shales, and if you look, you'll see the report concerns work done on behalf of the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission. So that's because they were actually looking at black shales for their uranium content initially. And this was an extraordinary document because it showed that we have known for quite a bit of time that black shales, and the Marcellus is a black shale, has a high radioactive signature. And these are just some quotes from that document. So a fairly positive relation between oil yield and uranium content exists for some of these shales. if you're a geologist in the oil and gas industry, you know this. You look for the hottest part, the richest part of the Marcellus by looking for the radioactivity signature. Again, it's no mystery. It's well known. It's how you find where you have the organics is where you'll have radioactivity as well. And here's a really important line. In 1960, they were looking at the shales. The oil obtainable from shale has a relatively high uranium content and is considered a possibly important byproduct. So the uranium was what initially they were looking at in black shales. The oil was, we'll deal with that maybe later. And now, of course, we are dealing with it, but initially, that's what was examined. The amount of uranium in these shales is extremely large, reckoned in billions of tons of metallic uranium. So again, this is known by the geologic community, 1960, and there were follow-up studies from that. And then I'm just going to go back. I'm going to go back one slide. Folks living here, I think, have a really good idea of what brine is, and maybe some idea of what drill cuttings are. But back, like in New York, when I initially had to take this story to editors, people have no idea what these things are. And I did not either initially. What is oil and gas waste? We think of oil and gas, but few people are aware there's different waste products coming up at an oil and gas wellhead. So go back to this little diagram. You'll have brine coming up. At virtually every oil and gas well is producing brine, and many wells are producing more brine than they are oil. That has to be taken care of. And then you have drill cuttings, and the concern if you're in a radioactive shale is that, remember, you're drilling vertically down. So in a conventional layer, vertically down, you're not necessarily going to be hitting that much radioactive material, not necessarily. With a black shale, with fracking, you drill down vertically, and then you go horizontally through the radioactive layer. So your drill cuttings are going to have a radioactive signature. As one gentleman who worked with a landfill in West Virginia told me, regulators were just blindsided by this issue. This was an extraordinary new stream of waste that the oil and gas industry did not have to deal with. They had drill cuttings before. They did not have radioactive drill cuttings that were this high, and they were completely unprepared for this. And that leads us to a question. So okay, we're seeing that there's a major problem, but how can these brine trucks, if they are carrying stuff that is hazardous, how are they going around just with the word water, with the word brine, without any labeling? And so this is how. And it's not the Halliburton loophole. This predates the Halliburton loophole. So late 1970s, there was an act called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And this was a really great idea. As a nation, we make hazardous waste. We have a lot of industry, that's great. And some of the waste is going to be hazardous. So the idea of this act, the short version, RCRA, RCRA, is to deal with the hazardous waste appropriately. We're going to acknowledge which waste is hazardous. We're going to appropriately put it into a certain type of truck. The driver driving that truck will have a certain type of training to deal with hazardous waste. And it will go to an appropriate landfill that can manage and handle that particular hazardous waste. But guess which industry gets an exemption? Oil and gas waste, despite containing many known hazards, is deemed non-hazardous. And the reasoning why is really important to look at. I mean, this is just quite extraordinary. The EPA was forced to look at this exemption in the late 1980s. And what they determined, yeah, there's uranium in oil and gas waste. There's arsenic, there's toxic heavy metals. There's a lot of hazardous things. But here is such an important line. If we actually labeled it hazardous, we would cause a severe economic impact on the industry and on oil and gas production in the US. Not only that, we wouldn't have enough disposal facilities. We would strain. We wouldn't even have enough landfills to deal with this stuff, and we wouldn't have enough regulators. It'd be a permitting burden. So therefore, we know it's hazardous, but we can't declare it hazardous. We're just going to have to declare it non-hazardous. Everything that we are seeing today comes from this decision. You could not have a brine truck carrying what I'll point out in just a moment is radioactive waste if you did not have this exemption. If this exemption did not exist, it would have to be placarded appropriately. Drivers would need appropriate training. And not only that, the material could not go in a landfill that's meant for our household garbage. for diapers and food waste. You couldn't be dumping this stuff. You'd often have to haul it to sites out west, low-level radioactive sites. One of them is in the Utah desert. So question that then comes up, well, wow, what happens if you close that exemption off? And these are just some of the folks that I spoke to in the story. I mean, it's been argued that if you close the loophole, you put the industry out of business. And just to go back for a moment, I can see why such an exemption, would be in place. I get the idea in the 1970s and 80s, in the middle of different oil wars and whatnot, like we want to keep this industry going. It makes sense to me. I don't think they had any idea the ramifications of just how disastrous it would be to give the industry this exemption. Another expert is someone at the University of Cincinnati, written extensively on energy development, saying disaster if you remove this exemption. I have talked to people in the oil and gas industry who have told me, it would actually be a good thing. We wouldn't mind it because it would weed out bad operators, and the better operators would flourish. But this is an important point. Someone who did analyze the cost of taking the waste to a landfill in Ohio versus taking it out to the Utah desert, where the waste would have to go if it did not receive this scientifically inaccurate exemption, and that's a 100-fold increase in cost. And I mean, if you're in business, 10 cents increase in cost means something. That is an extraordinary increase in cost. And the main thing is it is affecting workers. And this is what I've really focused on in the story. Sure, a lot of costs, a lot of calculations, crunchy numbers. But I mean, what about the driver who is forced to haul material? And these drivers, and I'm in touch with many of them for the story, they are told that they're hauling water. Or maybe they're told they're hauling salt water. They're not, okay? They're absolutely not. Well, before we get to the next slide, so okay, what are they hauling and how bad is it? So the number one radioactive element of concern is radium when we're talking about brine. Radium has a tendency to flow with water, so and it's been known for many years. The first studies finding radium in brine go back to the 1930s. Radium will come up with brine at the wellhead, and there's a decay process, and other radioactive elements follow from that. But we'll focus now on the radium. Radium is something our own government has looked at quite a bit because it's known to be a carcinogen. It can accumulate in the bones. Radium is called a bone seeker. That's because it has a similar makeup as calcium. So your body, if it's accidentally ingested or inhaled or incorporated into your skeleton, you will now have a radioactive element literally lodged in your bone and blasting out radiation continuously. And remember, there's a decay chain. So radium's in the middle of the cycle. So when it blasts out radiation, these are the dangerous particles, alpha particles, that can change DNA, destroy a cell, cause a mutation, potentially lead to a tumor. That's just one decay. There will be a series of decays. So you basically, you've now incorporated it into your body. So radium is something we're concerned about. What are the levels? The EPA safe drinking water limit for radium, 5 picocuries per liter is the unit. We'll just remember 5. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a limit, an industrial discharge limit of 60 picocuries per liter for radium-226, one of the isotopes of radium. Another common isotope of radium, radium-228. 60 is also the limit. So if you add those together, 120. So you have 5, 120. These are known regulator limits. Marcellus brine is often in the range of 4,000 to 9,000. The average from the Pennsylvania did a study, the DEP, and the average in that study of the brine was about 9,000 picocuries per liter. It's been, and this again from the same Pennsylvania study, registered as high as 28,500. So those are the numbers you're dealing with. And just to so many questions come in there, so many concerns. But the first one is, jump to road spreading, and you're just, it's an absolute catastrophe that this is being spread on the roads. And when I convey this to radiation experts, I've been able to connect with some fabulous experts. These are folks who've studied the nuclear industry, who've tracked radioactive waste in Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. And when I tell them these numbers and say that this is being spread on the roads, they drop the phone. They are completely blown away that this is happening. So another really important part of the reporting was to be led to a series of documents that conveyed to me that industry has absolutely known about this issue. You know, sure, I'm cracking into it, talking to people on the ground, talking to scientists, but finding that industry had their own articles about this, and they're decades old, was a very important confirmation of some of the facts that I was finding elsewhere. So here's Oil and Gas Journal, very prominent journal in the oil and gas industry, and this is essentially someone, you know, blowing the whistle, pulling an alarm bell very loudly. Radioactive materials could pose problems for the oil and gas industry. And some quotes from this article, just read the first one. In varying degrees of severity, norm contamination may exist at every oil and gas production site and related facilities, including pipe handling yards, metal reclamation areas, natural gas and NGL pipelines, gasoline plants, and NGL refineries and terminals. Essentially, the whole apparatus of the oil and gas production line. First thing I want to point out, so norm contamination. This is an important word. I am a writer, words are really important, and I feel it's actually so clever of them to call this norm. This is naturally occurring radioactive materials. I mean, this is a scary thing that they have nicknamed norms. So yeah, it's easy to read over. But if you want to do research for yourself on this, and this will, you know, be amazing. I didn't know this. So it's like kind of an incredible thing. Just type naturally occurring radioactive materials into Google, or even better, go to Google Scholar. You can search research documents. And you'll see there's so much literature on this. But that's what that word means. And then just to point out the second part of the sentence, so how is it possible that all of these facilities, all these downstream facilities, have radioactivity? This is another important revelation. It's not just a wellhead issue, and even the industry is acknowledging this in detail. And that the reason being is because, again, you have decay happening. So one radioactive element will blast off radiation, and when it does that, it's lost a piece of itself. It's now become something else. And with radium-226, the direct decay product is radon. Radon is a gas. It's a noble gas. That means it doesn't really like to bond with anything. It doesn't, you know, collect, precipitate out. It just keeps flowing, and it flows with methane, ethane, and propane. This is well documented in the industry research. It flows with these streams, the methane and the natural gas liquids. So in a pipeline, for example, at a compressor station, at a natural gas processing plant, you will have radon flowing through the system. Radon has a quick half-life, about 3.8 days, and it will decay out. It goes through a series of very swift decays, and then for about 22.3 years, it's radioactive lead, lead-210. It's a radioactive isotope of lead. So what you'll have is you'll have radon flowing through the pipeline system, and it decays out, and when it becomes lead, it will often stick onto a pipeline, but most commonly stick to like a pump, a filter, some sort of valve. And if you just think of your kitchen sink where gunk would accumulate, you know, it's often like a turn, or somewhere where you have a filter to catch things. That makes sense. So this is the same thing in the industry. The industry often calls this scale, sludge sometimes if it's not as solid. But these scales accumulate on pipelines, in petrochemical infrastructure. This all was completely new to me. And it's not just, it's kind of an abstract concept unless you have a human involved. And so there are people involved. And I'll just tell a piece of the reporting. It's not in the Rolling Stone story, but it's something that will be in the book. So you have these pipes and pumps and valves in these very important industry facilities. They need to keep product moving, right? So if your pump gets gunked up, you have to clean it as swiftly as possible and get it back in and get product flowing, right? Well, your gunk happens to be radioactive. Does not seem from the reporting I've done that the workers are aware, and in this one case, I know they're not. So what happens is these pumps and valves are often sent, literally in the US mail, to facilities that are far away from the oil and gas field. The source I'm in contact with works in Colorado. He works in a little machine shop, did not have windows, no respirator, and he's a machinist, and it's a really delicate job. You have this complicated pump, and he has to remove this scale, which is difficult to remove. You know, and he has to do it without breaking this expensive equipment. He's creating dust, and dust is insidious. Dust is the dust, you know, friendly little thing. Oh, it's dusty. No. When it comes to radioactivity, dust is deadly because radium will hitch to dust, and dust can easily be breathed in. We don't even realize it. We're often breathing in dust. It will land on your clothes, take it home to your family, accidentally ingested. And so this worker, who's far away from the oil field, is doing a job that is very dangerous, actually one of the most worrisome radioactive exposures. And he's doing it at a site that's right across from a new brewery. It's in this kind of hip part of town where there's businesses popping up. And there they are cleaning this material. And this just gives you an idea of kind of the economic crunch, because he's conveyed to me, if this material had to be labeled accurately, our operation would not be able to be like in a shopping plaza. We would have to be a facility sited in a very specific way, dealing with hazardous material far away from the commercial center of the town. So you can start to see some of the reasoning how this is out there. But you know, his story is very difficult. He's not working there anymore. You know, he's a whistleblower and you know, left the job. And this is something I'll be reporting more on. But it's just such an important pathway. It's not just that these things are accumulating. You know, a human at the other end would be cleaning these types of equipment. And yeah, again, this 1990 document is just so powerful because it describes this all well. There's none of the you know, curving around with an argument. I mean, this is just a science journal laying out the risks. Skip that one for a moment. Okay, another important document, and I know there's environmental science students here, which is awesome. So this is the first study that we are aware of that documents radioactivity in oil and gas. It's a study done in Petrolia, Ontario. That's an oil and gas producing region in southern Ontario. It was a very simple study. Went to a farmer's field, got a well, took a batch of crude right out of the ground, and was able to measure that there were emanations, meaning like, you know, there were radioactive particles which were put up against a photographic plate, and when that's done, when the radiation blasts out, it makes little marks on the photographic plate. So they could determine that there's radioactivity there. We didn't even know the gas was called radon at the time, but that's what they observed. They observed a radioactive gas, which we now know to be radon. So that is a simple experiment. That experiment, and I would love it to be done, if you know, folks could do it in a safe way, but you know, it could be done by students today. It's a 116-year-old experiment, and right now we have not repeated that experiment. So we have no idea the radon levels at the wellheads, and this is such an important metric, because if you know that, you know how at risk should wellhead workers be, how at risk should everyone downstream be, how much radioactive lead will be accumulating at the pipes. If you know how much radon's there initially, you can start to make these calculations. There's very few data points on this. I know researchers have tried to do this experiment. They have not been granted access to wellheads. And again, this just blows me away. I mean, in 1904 they did it. They got the numbers, they wrote a research paper. Why can't we just replicate this simple experiment? It would give very important data. Okay, I'm just gonna, let's go, just two more points here, and then we'll go to Sil. So yeah, as I started reporting, you get a bigger knowledge base, and I learned more, and it just really, it became difficult to learn, because some of this material is it's just hard, because there are people at the end of all of this. I'm always learning, researching, and then coming back to these communities, southwestern Pennsylvania, eastern and southern Ohio, northern West Virginia. That's where I did most of the reporting. Something that came out towards the end of the reporting was that the Department of Transportation actually does have limits for radioactivity. So go back to that RCRA exemption. Brine trucks are exempt, right? They don't have to be labeled as hazardous. I know Fire Chief Still will talk about all the ramifications of that. Well, it turns out there is another standard. There's a radioactivity limit, and there is a threshold for that. And if trucks are above that limit, they have to be placarded as radioactive. And when a radiation expert analyzed these numbers, which I then ran by the Department of Transportation, he determined, oh, yes, Marcellus brine trucks, again, using the Pennsylvania DEP's own numbers, they would be about 1,000 times above the Nuclear Regulatory Commission limits, but the one that really matters, about 6 times above DOT limits. So these trucks should be placarded, at least the ones in this range. as radioactive. And what does it mean that they're not? Well, if they had a radioactive placard, for one, drivers would need hazmat training. They would need to know what was in their trucks. They couldn't be told, as they often are, you're just hauling water, you're just hauling salt water. The trucks would only be able to take certain routes. So I know in Barnesville, Ohio, there was a crash right next to a reservoir. Trucks could not go next to reservoirs if they were appropriately placarded. And placard, again, is that like little diamond-shaped symbol you see on the truck. They couldn't go near certain commercial sites, certain things like schools. So this is a really big deal. And an important point, I mean, when I learned this, and I have a good contact at the DOT, so I bounce this information off of him, because I'm like, how is this possible? Why aren't you testing? I know the levels of the Marcellus. The scientists know the levels of the Marcellus brine. From what we know, if a truck was filled with material with those levels, it would be above your limit. So how are these trucks not being placarded? And he said, well, it doesn't matter what the scientists know. It doesn't matter what's known in the literature. All that matters is a sample that is taken from the point when the operator dispatches the brine to the truck. So I'm like, oh, wait, so you're telling me that they're doing it and you're trusting their numbers? What if they don't do it? And his response was, oh, so you're wondering what if they're breaking the law? Well, I guess that could be happening. And that, I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's so great when there's a contact in a department who can talk, because then I can, kind of verify things I was suspecting. So essentially saying it's a self-regulating process. If they don't test, there's no way. They don't, as the regulator, know what's in those trucks. So we'll just keep them unplacarded. What I hope will result from talks like this is people will, appropriately connect with the DOT and demand an investigation. Because they've told, I said, well, what would spur you all to do an investigation? They're like, well, if enough people call us. Before, I'm just going to have one more slide, but this is, it's just a very powerful, powerful slide. It's a powerful document. And this also came right at the end of the reporting. The question the entire time that kept popping up is, I'm learning the numbers, I'm talking to scientists, some of the best scientists are conveying there's risk, I'm bouncing that off other scientists. I'm always trying to talk to the industry. I can show you the email chain from the API, the American Petroleum Institute, despite the fact that they wrote a 1982 paper that's many pages long talking about risk. The reply to me, and I sent detailed questions, is about 3 lines. So it's hard, okay, that's your information, I can't do much with that. But the question is, what are really the risks? Are workers potentially in danger, and how much in danger? And towards the end of the reporting, I was led to a set of Louisiana legal cases that involve oil and gas workers who work very common jobs. Roughneck, roustabout, derrickman, a truck driver hauling sludge, people cleaning scale out of pipes, similar to the job I was describing, the gentleman out in Colorado. And these workers received cancers that were indisputably linked to their radioactivity exposure on the job. And the way this was analyzed is really quite revealing of some of the gaps in our regulatory system. So this is the document. What this is the expert testimony. It's a report written by the radiation expert who served as the expert in these legal cases. So they conducted interviews with these workers or their workers' families. They learned the details of the worker's job. And they tabulated up very meticulously the exposure. And I know Pennsylvania has done, again, this TNOR report. It's what they call a thorough look at the risk of oil and gas. When you look at radioactivity, when you look at that report and the way they tabbed up their exposures, and you look at this report, you see the difference between a shoddy job and a thorough job of analyzing risk. So in this report, every detail of the worker's job is analyzed. So for example, if you're working in one of these yards where you're cleaning scale out of a pipe, are you wearing a respirator or are you not? Even if you're wearing a respirator, you're still breathing in dust. How fast are you breathing? How many particles of dust is in each little cubic centimeter of air? Do you eat lunch in the workplace? Even something like licking your lips, where dust would settle, adds to exposure. All these things are added up. And then there's actually a program developed by the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, and it was made to assess exposure in nuclear industry workers and determine if cancers they received were linked to radioactivity. So another agency becomes involved here. Part of the CDC is NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They've done great work on a lot of different industries to keep workers safer. They did not answer my questions on this issue, and I now know that they have a program where you can analyze worker exposure. That's what they did. That program kicks out a number that tells you, how likely it is that this worker's this worker's cancer was connected to their radioactivity exposure. And in these cases, it was like 99.3%, 99.7%. And as the expert, and I'm also in touch with a lawyer, told me this is indisputable. And you all know how powerful this industry is in court, how many lawyers they have. These cases, the industry didn't win, they settled. They settled these cases. So I think that conveys that the science is damning on this. You can't walk around it. You can't confuse around it, which will often try to be done in court. I mean, we have a government program. You can tab in numbers, and it gives other results. We have copies of this paper here, and I've given talks now in northern West Virginia, in southern Ohio. A lot of workers have attended. I mean, this is important material. I understand the difficulty of presenting this back in a community, where some people rely heavily on oil and gas jobs. But, when I, as someone who likes to get an idea out when I find something like this, I'm certainly, I'm going to appropriately present it, but I'm not going to hide it. So this is here, and just 2 quick notes on that. A lot of these workers, they were working in these jobs, for many years at a time. So it isn't just like, 1 day on the job or 1 month on the job is necessarily going to give you an exposure. They were working for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and things added up. But they did develop cancers, different types of lymphomas, different types of leukemias, colon cancer. And what's very important also is certain jobs. And I'll just end it here. So brine hauling, yeah, maybe if you're driving the truck, you're far away, your exposure is not necessarily that bad. But I've spoken to many brine haulers. One of the jobs associated with driving a brine truck is cleaning the sludge out of the tank. So how's that done? They send a human being into a brine tank. The way it was described to me with like a squeegee, and you scrape out the sides, you attach what's called a super sucker, a type of truck with, it looks like a brine truck, but it has a vacuum pump. And you've got to like scrape this stuff out and have it be sucked out. That job is dangerous. That job, you're in an enclosed space where the walls are covered with radioactivity and it's accumulated over time. And so specific jobs like that, done over time, and the worker I talked to said he did that job once a week. These are the really worrisome types of jobs. Yeah, I suggest, and definitely, I think we'll do questions at the end, but now I'm going to hand it off to someone who just made this story possible. Again, it would not have been possible without connections to people here who knew so much better than I what was happening in their communities. And there were a lot of great people who helped me in my research. Without a doubt, one of the best ones was Fire Chief Sil Caggiano. It took all types of people to step out, okay? And a fire chief, I think one of the few people that we love across the board, right? I mean, they are out there helping us, you've seen what's happening in Australia, it's firefighters, always on the front lines of an issue, but it was really powerful that Sil came out. Sil has an incredible background in hazardous material. He knows about radioactivity, and he was able to walk me through, what does this mean for his people? What does it mean to show up on a brine truck, not know what's in it, and you've got firefighters who have to deal with this? So, Sil, yeah, thank you.